Those are only for bishops. I'm just a humble dean. So as you know, I do think this Reverend Lark is a load of malarkey, to be honest with you all. I mean, so you have, it's 17th century, I think it all began, where clergy were to be revered, hence reverend. So technically it's an adjective. And then if you're a cathedral dean, you were very to be revered, and dean of a seminary was considered in the American system equivalent to cathedral deans. So yes, I'm very to be revered. And then with bishops, of course, it's right to revere them. After all, they are in the apostolic succession. Now, trust me, I know quite a lot of bishops, and not all of them it's so right to revere them, to be honest. This is being recorded. Naturally, all the ones I know and under whom I'm required to obey, they are definitely right to be revered. And Michael Curry, the presiding bishop, is most to be revered. Actually, I think that's a good call. So, so anyway, yes, I'm a very to be revered person. Now you know. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about applied ethics, and so applied ethics was part of the professionalization of ethics. What do I mean by that? Once upon a time, ethical methodology was very focused with moral theories that try to describe what the ethical is. But if you were a nurse, or if you were a doctor, or if you were a lawyer, or if you were in business, you actually wanted something much more down to earth. You wanted to be able to start with some of the problems you face in the context in which you work and try to resolve the ethical considerations you need to take into account. So a whole industry generated that starts with the situations professionals often feel in certain professions and moved up to what are the ethical principles. So it was a reverse of the traditional way of thinking about the ethical. So it starts with the situations we face and then moves out. I'm just going to start by thinking a little bit about some of the principles as Christians we bring to situations. So just to remind you all, as Christians, we are required to try and work out what God wants us to do in a given situation. Or as that lovely little bracelet that evangelicals used to wear, WWJD, is actually not bad. What would Jesus do, right? So you're trying to work out what you think God requires of this situation. And when you frame it like that, you then say, well, okay, what do Christians believe that God has given us, that gives us a sense of what God values? And I list 4 on your sheet. I start with the eternal word. So that is the claim that we make of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was the eternal word embodied, right? So if you ask the question, if a friend of yours says to you, how do you know what God thinks is right and wrong? Okay? The first answer you give is, I know what God thinks is right and wrong by looking at the words and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. Because John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John 1:12, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So if you look at Jesus of Nazareth, you can see you're looking at the very thought of God on earth. And from that, you can work out what God thinks is important. We learn about Jesus in Scripture. So we talk about Scripture being the Word of God. So that's the second source. And we receive both the eternal Word and the Bible through the history of the church. So through tradition. G.K. Chesterton once said, tradition is simply giving a vote to all those who've come before us. And I think that's a good definition, tradition. And then we apply our reason, right? Because much of this is unclear, exactly what principles apply to different situations. So you have to apply your reason to try and work out what therefore is right. So let's think a little bit about some of the principles that have shaped ethical deliberation. And I suggest there are three. The first is the Imago Dei. That's the image of God. So Christians do not think that people are just complicated bundles of atoms that emerge from nowhere and are going nowhere. We actually do think that we are persons made in the image of God. And what do we mean by that? It means that we have the capacity to choose between good and bad. It means we have the capacity to reason, to think through what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. It means that we have the capacity to love, to learn how to give and receive love. These are the qualities that make up the Imago Dei. It means that every single person is of intrinsic value. C.S. Lewis has a nice expression that whenever you meet a person, just be in awe of the reality that you're encountering. Because when you think about being a person's pretty amazing, we see, hear, laugh, smile, love, we think. I mean, it's so much just going on in each of us right now. It's just astonishing. So be in awe of a person, and that's because that person's made in the image of God, and that therefore implies that they have significance. The second principle is that word love. What are the two greatest commandments, says Jesus? Do you know, I had my tetanus jab on Friday, and it's suddenly sore just doing that. I thought, good heavens. Okay. What are the two great commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. That's the first. And the second is like unto it, says Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Two really demanding commandments, but that has been central to the Christian witness. We are a tradition that believes that the task of learning how to give and receive love is at the heart of being human and created by God. And then the third is actually found in the tradition. So you find it in Aristotle, you find it in Plato, you find it in a lot of secular theorists, you find it in a lot of Roman Catholic social ethics. It's the concept of the common good. So this is the view that when we think about how we live together, we have an obligation to think of all of us, not just some of us, and try and arrive at policies that enable all to flourish. Okay, so I've started very macro. I'm determined just to work through the tetanus pain. So I've started very macro, and now let's think of some case studies. And I am going to ask you to put your hand up. If you don't want to put your hand up, don't. That's fine. But if you dare, that's good. And as we work through each of these case studies, we can think a little bit about what are the values we're bringing to the case study. So you're at a grocery store in the District of Columbia. Now, as you probably notice, when you go grocery shopping in DC, those parking lots are small, right? You need to come to rural Virginia, parking lots are big and spaces are large. You're in DC, you're winding down, you're trying to get around, and all the spaces are about as small as they can get away with. As you're pulling the car out of a tight space, you accidentally dent the neighboring car. I wrote call, sorry about that. Now, you do glance around and check that there are no cameras, and as it happens, no one saw you. So, what do you do? Now, can I just say, I'm not going to even put this out to a vote, because the right answer is you leave a note saying, I'm sorry, I dented your car, and everything else. And if you don't have a pad and pen, you go back into the store, you buy one, you come back down, you write the note out. Now, of course, we can make that dilemma a little more complicated. We could imagine a situation where somebody really can't afford to repair somebody else's car. But nevertheless, you still leave the note. So what's going on there? Well, it's a matter of the fact that nobody actually saw you is theologically irrelevant, because of course God did. And you do what's right simply because it's right, not because you're worried about detection or punishment. You know, ideally, and therefore, and you can tell if you're a virtuous person. A saint just doesn't even think about it. The note is written, it's put underneath. You're less virtuous if you sit there going, oh, that could be a couple of $1,000. This is a real pain. I'd rather it hadn't happened. Okay, but the right answer is yes, you do need a note. And what are the primary principle is the Imago Dei, grounded in the sense of integrity. So it's a self before God, and you are a person who's honest with your God, with yourself, and with others. Okay. All right, this one. Your teenage son, who's 15 years old, and if it makes it easier, you can imagine a grandchild who's staying with you for 6 months, spends many hours online. I'll come with you in 1 second.
You didn't say whether he left his contact information on the note.
So what you do, yeah, yeah, exactly. Dear dented car, I'm sorry I dented it. Love, the denter. Now the idea is that's a good move, but the idea is yes, you add your telephone number. And of course, ideally, you've got insurance to cover these eventualities. So yes, you are supposed to leave your contact information. I'm glad we clarified that. I don't want... Okay, so your teenage son spends many hours online. A friend of yours suggests that you should go and look at the search history. And you should do so when he's at high school. What do you do? Yes, please.
You check the search history.
Period.
I'm a mom, I'm a teacher. You know, I don't mean to be a bummer on Sunday morning, but kids meet up with someone online and they could get hurt or killed or something, you know. I grew up without computers.
Yeah.
You know, we shared the telephone. My parents knew what was going on. I think it's really imperative, and I don't think it's a matter of ethics, but you could talk to the child first and say, look, I'm a little worried. You know, there's trees outside. You could take the dog for a walk. There's
Right.
things to do other than the screen. And I'd like to know what you're looking at. Could you tell me about that?
Okay, so yes.
As a public school employee, we can see what you're looking at anyway. So by all means, look at what the child is looking at.
Yeah.
This is... Okay, so does anybody...
It's a cool device. We know what you're looking at.
So
And also, as a teacher, sorry, I'm a mandated reporter,
Yeah.
and so are you.
Yeah.
If I know a child is being abused, neglected, or engaging in dangerous behavior and I don't report it, that's a $5,000 fine to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so does anybody dissent from this invasion of a child's, a teenager's privacy? Yes, please.
Sorry. I was a high school teacher for 4 years before coming to BTS. I think I would want to know first if there were other signs that the child was on sites that were questionable or doing things that were questionable. I don't think I would want to just assume that because they're online a lot, that therefore means that they're doing something problematic, right?
Right.
So I'm not saying don't look at it at all, right? But maybe, you know, I would talk to them first and
Yeah.
try to figure out or see if there's other signs.
And yes, please.
Can we make the child 18 and a half years old?
And why would that be different?
The child is technically an adult.
Right, so they can do what they like.
Well, there are also a whole raft of privacy issues kick in, especially health issues,
Yeah,
where a parent or a guardian technically cannot access an 18 and a half year old or 18 plus 1
yeah,
year old health records.
yeah.
So that throws us into a whole new ballgame.
Right, so this is great. Thank you very much for these contributions. And you're right. So notice that the journey we've made a journey from this information is available, right, in the sense that certainly big tech is very aware of every single search you do and collects a record. And as you know, what they used to do, you know that moment when you've thinking about going to, I don't know, Jamaica for a vacation. and you've just been looking at flights and looking at possible hotels, and then you come out and you go into Amazon, and down the side is an ad for Jamaica. Have you ever experienced that? So the product that Google sells is they sell your search history in real time to potential advertisers who then create targeted advertising for you, right? So that was the reality you were drawing your attention to. You are right that there are real risks in this world. Cyberbullying is a real risk. Inappropriate websites is a real risk. They might be getting into QAnon conspiracies is a potential risk. They might be taking an interest in anti-Semitic or white supremacists. I mean, there are lots of sins which are in abundance in this world. But you have a relationship. You have a relationship with a child. I mean, one of the problems is, of course, so you find that they've been looking at, say, pornographic websites. What do you do with that information once you've ascertained it? And then you're right, once they're an adult, that becomes more complicated again. So let's think about it standing back as a Christian. You know, the relationship is key. So I think the ethical thing to do is make every gadget you give to a child until they're an adult on the understanding you reserve the right to take an interest in how that gadget's used, and perhaps add to that condition periodic checks, and also say that that child needs to be forthcoming and use the gadget responsibly. So in other words, do it all at the beginning before they start exploring this world. And then of course, there's a contract. There's a relationship that's safeguarded, and there's a contract which then enables you to do the work that I think is wise. Yes, sir?
What if you change on this online business to a diary?
To a diary, yes, that's a very good illustration, right, yeah. So would you go and look at your child's journal? Would you go and look at the diary of a child? Under what circumstances would you? Now, the thing about the diary, though, that is slightly different because, of course, that's just a conversation between the inner life of a person and a text. And nobody else is participating in it. But having said all that, of course, if you suspect your child's being bullied, or if you suspect going back to your point, or if you suspect your child is potentially becoming anorexic, you might want information. So then you would have to decide, do I invade this person's privacy to look at a source that might give me that information? That's a classic illustration of the divide between deontological and consequentialist ethics. Yes. So deontological means you take a rule and apply it to all situations and don't violate it. So do not lie means I do not lie in any circumstance. Teleological or consequentialist means you try and work out the ultimate scenario or consequences and do the course of action that you think will bring about the best outcome. If you're deontological, you probably wouldn't look at the diary. If you're a consequentialist, you might, if you have other reasons to be concerned. Yeah.
Just briefly, my daughter's 31. All that means is I can no longer lie about my age. But I moved to DC from Chicago recently to live next to her. And what I found now that I'm in, she calls it her city, I need to say to her, hey, could you tell me more about that? So
Right.
in this scenario, to me, it's the relationship, whether I'm teaching a student or it's my own child. Hey, you know what? I just noticed you're just on the computer for like 7 hours. Could you tell me more about that? What
Right.
is it you're so interested in? Because otherwise, you know, it turns into like a shaming thing. And I don't want to be creepy and nosy,
Right.
you know, but it is about, if she's my only child, I want her to have the best life. So like I met with her yesterday, could you tell me more about that?
Yeah.
You know?
No, that's right. And the dynamic, the value, the Christian value here is love. You know, it's the relationship, it's the centrality of the relationship, it's seeking the best for the other. And where it gets complicated is what I might think as a father is best isn't necessarily what is best and isn't necessarily what my son thinks is best. So that might be a little bit of
And as this
complexity.
gentleman said, once they're over 18.
Yeah, no, it's a different world. Yes?
Just a question. I think if you're asking the question what Jesus would have done,
Hmm.
and you think back to, one is always hesitant to be an original intent person in this crowd. And so I'll try to stay away from that. But if you think back to what Jesus would have done about and how his society looked upon the relationship between a parent and a child, I don't think there's any question about the fact that Jesus himself and all other Jews of his society would have looked at the matter.
That's a very interesting observation, and I'm grateful for you lifting it up. So a couple of quick comments. One of the insights that the Christian tradition brings to bear to ethical debate is that we do believe it's both difficult and complicated, partly because our sources are ambiguous. You know, I'm involved in the Christian-Muslim dialogue a great deal, and that's one point that the Muslims always feel they're stronger. They say, well, at least the Quran's clear in a way the Bible isn't, because at least the Quran makes it clear these are the words of Allah, and the Bible, most of the time, are just words of people talking with God popping up as a character, and a lot of the texts are sort of puzzling. But I actually try to turn it round when I'm talking to them, and I say, well, I think it's partly because we believe that God does not want to make the ethical obvious and wants us to actually do the work of discernment in conversation, holding what we believe to be true with some humility, striving to think through what makes sense. So I think you're right. When you ask the question, one problem I have with WWJD is, you know, it's potentially oversimplifying a complex exercise. Now, Jesus on children is really interesting, though, because you've got to remember, in the first century, children were ethically insignificant. So the amazing thing about the story in Matthew, when Jesus says, let the little children come unto me, you should be as a child to enter the kingdom of God, was the value Jesus was placing on children. That was the shock in the text. These human beings matter. You cannot treat them as ethically insignificant. Now, in a culture where, therefore, there's no question whatsoever they would not allow a child any rights, Jesus actually, in a funny sort of way, says, hang on a second. They also have value. Indeed, so much you need to be as one to be in the kingdom. So you can turn your argument round just a little bit and arrive to the view, actually, although you're right, culturally, and if Jesus had had children, almost certainly there would have been no sense of privacy for a child. Nevertheless, Jesus' teaching here actually gives dignity to the child and invites you to honor the relationship. So the whole thing gets a bit more complicated pretty quickly. That's the joy of applied ethics. Okay, your spouse gives you 23andMe. 23andMe is a product you can buy for $99. I think it's now $199. And you have a choice. You can learn you've got 1 million relatives all around you. Fortunately, most of them pretty remote, so you needn't worry too much about any family obligations that might arise from it. And the other thing you can learn is they can do health screening. So they can check you for genetic markers. Now remember, interpreting these are tricky. You can have a genetic marker for something and it doesn't necessarily mean you end up with the illness or the condition. Because it's all it's actually measuring is probability, right? So you can have a genetic marker, and then if other things correlate, diet, exercise, then you're at significant risk of the marker expressing itself. Okay, so 23andMe, you receive it, you you do the whole thing, you do the ancestry, you do the health screening. And when you do the health screening, you discover that you have the gene for early onset Alzheimer's. You happen to be one of 6 siblings. Do you inform your siblings of what you have learned? Yes?
My colleague says it's an easy one, and it's actually easier than the parking lot and it's all based on the Second Commandment. I mean, would you want to know?
So you do?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And also because the resentment that will happen in the future if something happens, because of course forewarned is forearmed.
So, any dissenters? Yes, please.
I agree with it. I mean, what good can come of it?
If you don't say, or if you do say.
If you did say what good could come of it.
Well, they could prepare for what's going to happen.
They could.
Oh, let's not be preparing for death all the time. I guess it's supposed to.
But all I meant was, you know, as a mother, and most of the time I was a single mother, except for about 5 years. The point is, you know, it will affect my loved ones, my child, the people around me, and they might want to know why mom's forgetting things.
Yeah.
Or, you know, just out of, like you said, the 10 Commandments, out of kindness to love others as we love ourselves. It would be a kind thing to do.
Yes.
My father actually had dementia, and my aunt had dementia, and I have an uncle who had dementia. So all three out of 5 of those children had it. Of course, they didn't know. You didn't know who was going to get it. So I think it's probably a good thing to know. And chances are, if they have that genetic, you know, leaning towards it, someone in their past has had it, so they know to start. Nowadays, we know you can start expecting it. So I think, you know, if you have a sibling and they're going to start getting it, you're going to know. And I think it's a good thing to know. Personally, the earlier the better, that you can know as a family.
Right. Now this is, yes please.
Well, if you flip it and said, sometime in the future, one of the other siblings developed early onset Alzheimer's, and the one who did the test said, oh, well, yeah, I knew that 10 years ago. I did this test, and I knew we had the genetic marker. And then the whole family would go, well, why didn't you tell us?
Right, okay. So this is interesting. So this is actually highly contentious in the literature for a number of reasons. The first is we're developing a concept of being genetically sick even though you're well, which sounds very paradoxical, but there is a sense in which you're learning information about yourself that isn't inevitable, but nevertheless changes your perception of yourself and also puts you at some risk in terms of life insurance and long-term health care. You know, because of course the big anxiety in society is once this information becomes widely available, then who would love to have it? Every life insurance policy, every long-term care insurance provider would love to have this information and would love to up your premiums because you have the genetic marker. So actually it's a highly contested area in Christian ethics, in medical ethics, precisely because, and there is a whole school of thought that says, you know, just don't go here. Too much information can be, you know, problematic. There are some things you just don't need to know. Now, as it happens, this is describing me. Yes, I don't actually have the marker for early onset Alzheimer's. I have the marker for late onset Alzheimer's. And so I am one of 6. My mother was very organized. It goes girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. I'm number 4, okay, so I am the persecuted middle children. Can I just say, in solidarity to all middle children, we are the most persecuted in all families. And actually, the view I took is I reached out to my siblings and I said, would you like to know? And if you do, I will tell you. If you don't, I won't tell you. They all did, and they've all received the information, and it's all fine. Yeah.
How reliable is that supposed to be?
Right, now that's true. 23andMe is probably less reliable than other providers. You can get, you know, products that are both very expensive and much more detailed and much more reliable. So it's an option. This is like the popular, accessible version. Yeah.
Hello, middle child.
Thank you.
My dad was married to someone else when he passed away. He'd been married to my mom 33 years. But anyway, we were not allowed to get any medical information. Unfortunately, couldn't say goodbye to him for about a year before he died. He had Parkinson's. So I was very interested to know if that would happen to me or my daughter. But legally, I was able to call his doctor after he passed. And my dad's sister had the Parkinson's. So I said, am I, is this genetically predisposed? He said, absolutely not. It is not.
Right.
So his other sister did not get it, but it was a big relief. And he said, I'm so glad you called because I wondered why his daughters hadn't brought him to appointments. I said, well, that's another pot of tea. But I was so relieved that I could let my daughter know even Grandpa died of Parkinson's and eventually get dementia as a feature of that we were okay.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
No, definitely. Okay. All right, so you're in a job search process. Like everyone, you've applied for several positions. 2 employers move your application through. 1 employer decides to offer you the position. You do a check with the other one, which you would prefer to get, but they're not in a position to make an offer at this time. So you accept the first offer. 2 weeks later, before you've started, you're still working your notice with your current employer, the second employer makes an offer. You would prefer the job. Do you go back on your acceptance to the first employer? Yes. So lots of yeses over here. Is it general yeses?
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
growing up, I was always taught not to do anything like that.
Right.
There's just no question about it. If you accepted A, whatever it was, you could not then accept B that came in later. But I have noticed in recent years that that is not the
Thank you.
Sick, this and that, sorry I didn't get back to you for 2 weeks. I finally thought, this is nuts. And then they called and offered me the job after I'd accepted another one. I said, just a heads up on this. You didn't respond for a month and a half, so no,
Yeah.
I took a different job.
Yeah.
And they were so educational. They said, well, we're going to make a case study of this interview. I said, you know what, have a nice day. Have a nice day.
Applied ethics then works from case studies up. And what we've just done in this little exercise is we've actually faced some very practical case studies. You'll notice a lot of them to do with the Imago Dei, who we are, how we are before God, how we are towards others. Some are to do with love, the centrality of relationships, and the importance of relationships with family in respect to genetic testing and in respect to your child, in respect to privacy. And some are to do with the common good. You know, we want a society where people function in certain ways. Applied ethics gets very technical in medical and legal and business realms, and I just give you one little illustration. This is actually discussed, this is an actual situation that a hospital faced, and it did go to their ethics committee, which is increasingly common, that there is some sort of group who make recommendations in situations such as this. William MacArthur was a practicing Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in blood transfusions because the Bible forbids ingesting blood. But doctors believed MacArthur, who was in the end-stage renal failure, would die without a transfusion. Still, MacArthur insisted no transfusion. On top of that, the parent had to be resuscitated twice using CPR after heart attacks. The doctor treating MacArthur pointed out that further CPR would be medically futile without the option of a transfusion. Still, MacArthur refused to sign a do not resuscitate order, hoping to live as long as possible. But the doctor felt just as strongly as MacArthur that CPR would not help and should not be performed. Do you know what's quite interesting about this is that this is a case where resources come into play. You know, one difficulty we have in medical care generally, and this isn't surprising, the bulk of expenditures in terms of medical expenditures come towards the end of life. For the obvious reason, that's when you're pretty sick, and therefore you get tons of attention and lots of hospital stays and all that sort of stuff. And one issue in the whole medical debate, at what point do you decide certain treatments are not helpful or suitable for a person who's unlikely to live a long time, and unlikely to live at all, and has too many risk factors that makes the operation unlikely to be successful. These are real issues that hospitals have to navigate and sort out. Are there any thoughts as you look at that case study that people, would you take the view that the hospital should just say we won't do CPR given that you're unlikely to survive? No, you would still do it.
Absolutely.
You would.
Hey, yeah, CPR, that's not expensive.
Right. Okay. No, that's good.
Well, except having faced some of this with my own father in the last year, as people are older, you can CPR and chest compressions can break their ribs.
Right.
Things much worse for them, and so the question is, do you make them? Do you put them in more pain and suffering?
Right.
And I think the other experience I had with when my mother died, our previous rector here actually said, when we knew that there was no hope, said, we're just not going to get in the way of things unfolding. And so just kind of let's make this person as comfortable as possible, but don't get in the way of anything that would, again, cause harm or,
Yeah.
But if the person has chosen to say, I want resuscitation, you can stay if there's breaking ribs.
I don't see
If
how
they
you
still
can
choose
refuse
it.
it.
Exactly.
yeah, because most people have a DNR. I know
Right.
my mother had a DNR, my aunt has one on the refrigerator. Most people have a DNR. You know, there's one in my will.
And it depends on the designated medical power of attorney for someone.
Right, that's true as well.
And I know, you always can constantly change how you want, what you want done to someone when they're in that stage of dying and stuff. It's not, you don't just have to go through the DNR or medical power of attorney or any of those things they sign their wills or stuff. You can actually change it as they move along in their end stages.
Yeah.
So I think that's a difficult decision, but if they have specifically said that they're not going to sign the DNR, I don't think they have an ethic. I think they ethically have to do the continue to do CPR,
Right.
do the best they can.
So, this is the world of applied ethics. You're starting with situations and moving out. What's the crucial, yes please.
So what
So in this particular case, they did continue to do CPR.
They didn't cease to do CPR?
No, they did continue.
Oh, they didn't.
Yeah, they honoured his wishes. But what's interesting is in medical ethics, a huge value is the Imago Dei, is patient autonomy, patient rights. The complexity here is, of course, information, because in the end, the source of that information is doctors, and they're giving you the information, so how you interpret that and how reliable it is, because it's like all professions. You know, some doctors are better than other doctors, so you have that complexity. So, standing back, how do we navigate this as Christians? Well, in 2 seconds, I will just make the following comments. The first is that notice the obligation to think about problems holistically and allow a number of factors to bubble to the fore. So allow yourself to think through privacy and relationship in respect to the teenager and the diary or the search history. Also allow yourself to think a little bit about context and demands and what the issues are and risks. So in that case, we do worry about cyberbullying, and we do worry about the various rabbit holes you can find if you search hard enough for them. Then you also think a little bit about integrity, who you are as a person making ethical judgments before God, as a Christian, and in those situations, even if you can get away with something, one should pause and say, no, I need to do the right thing here. So that too is another factor that we seek to take into account. And the goal all the time is to navigate the world in such a way that our presence is constructive rather than destructive. To find ways of building bridges, forgiving, loving, understanding, rather than destroying bridges, provoking dissent or disagreement. And as you look forward to the joys of Thanksgiving, I can talk more about that because I'm back on the 20th. So I'll talk more about navigating the joys of Thanksgiving and families, even if the person you love is a devotee of QAnon. How do you navigate all that? Come back on the 20th, and I will give you the answer. Thank you very much for listening.